So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the last tutorial on the backend, on the construction of a backend for your web application. And let me check first whether everybody can hear me. Okay, good. So just a quick recap about what we've seen in the past three lectures. So we have seen how to use the OpenAPI specification to create the API, REST API of our web application. And we have seen that by means of the Swagger editor, we are able to generate all the skeleton of the application server, which is however empty in the sense that we must somehow hook up to the resources that are exposed over the OpenAPI gateway. We have to really hook up the database by writing suitable code in order to expose data coming from the database. So actually, yesterday we have seen one of the possible ways to do that, that is using a SQL query builder that allows us to extend services in order to be potentially portable over a range of databases. And we have seen a demonstration of how to do queries towards a relational database such as Postgres. Okay, and we have also seen how to extend the skeleton generated by the Swagger editor by serving static assets. Okay, and we wrote a very small HTML file that for the moment allows us to query the API and to render data towards in the browser. Okay. So just a quick mention, because yesterday was very, we didn't have much time, and I would like to underline the fact that since I had already a database available on my machine running with the same schema with some data, we were able to just hook up directly the services to the database. If you don't have, if you've installed Postgres, but you don't have any database running, keep in mind that the code that we wrote yesterday allows to create the tables that you need in the database. So it should be suitable enough, the code that we wrote yesterday, once you have installed Postgres, to have to create at least an empty table. Now, how to fill up this table? Yesterday, I've shown that there can be several programs that allows us to insert data into the database. In principle, you could do it even by working directly with the command line of the database. But in my case, I use the Postgres commander, which is an application that it's very simple. It's let me open it just to. Okay, it's very simple application that allows me to access the. Actually, when I install Postgres, it creates a database just for the user that so that for my user on this machine, which is called Zaccaria with my last name. And in this database, actually in the past I've run the some queries to create the books table, and just to have an idea, I mean, it is possible to insert data into this database by you know, with simple actions. So it doesn't, I mean, having to insert the data into the database should not be so difficult for you. I mean, you probably might find other ways to do that. The important thing is that there is a default database that is used for the user, and this is going to be used both by this interface and and your application. Summing up, let's say once you've installed Postgres, it should be enough to create the table with the code that we wrote yesterday. Now there are some questions on the chat. Filippo Maria Benati, is it mandatory to have front-end and back-end in the same folder and serve static files with Node, or can we separate the two? You could, in principle, serve assets from another source. Like, for example, if you use, for example, Amazon, you could use S3 to serve static files. So that's not, you know, something which is really. I mean, you could do that. Of course, keep in mind that whenever you have different sources for data in your browser, you might encounter problems with the content security policies, which is something which we are not going to see during these lectures, but there are policies to avoid, you know, problems that might happen when you have an application that works with several sources of the so with several servers, let's say, on the web. So that's something which is not mandatory, but I think it's for this course. I mean, for those of you who are not much confident with the let's say with the web development and all the possible problems that might happen when dealing with content security policies, then I would suggest to really serve static assets and the same API from the same server. But that's pretty much it. Okay, so this is just. Let's go back to our to the structure of our application, and the last thing that we're going to see today is how to authenticate the users into our application. So let me switch. So to authenticate someone or something means determining if the information provided by the user is true, genuine or valid. And so if you were a bank, for example, how would you check whether this is a genuine message, the one that you see here? Hey, I'm Gates and transfer 1 million to this other account. Okay, so how would you trust this? Well, in principle, the client must show that it knows a secret, which are called credentials, that are shared with the server, that have been shared with the server in the past. Okay, so that means a password that has been created by the user and is known only by the user. So and the cookies, the mechanism that we are going to see today, are the most used mechanism to manage the burden of credential validation. And so that means that after the this is a very simple picture that shows how cookies are used for, managing the burden of credential validation. So after the client has provided the credential, that is the password, username and password, the server checks within the database whether this user provided the correct password. Typically, this is done only by comparing the hashes of the password instead of the password itself. And once it has been checked that the password is correct, the server generates a unique session identifier, which is called cookie. And it is typically something which might be a simple, number, or something much more complex. And how do you use the session identifier? Well, the session identifier is then used by all these next requests coming from the client. For example, in this case, the client is accessing /mycart, and requests coming from the client, once it has been authenticated through a cookie, will contain the same cookie, will contain the same session identifier. So this means that once the server receives the request, it must not recheck again in the database whether the user is actually the one that he's saying to be. In the sense that the fact that the session identifier is already present in the request allows the server to get all the information from various sources within the application. That is, for example, whether in the database or in a memory, whether in a disk-based database or a memory store database or some kind of other key value storage. It allows us to get the user given the session and get the card for the user. So having a unique session identifier allows us to avoid to recheck again every time that the password is correct, but to directly go and get the user identifier and all the other information associated with the user itself. So and the server can answer with the same with the data, in this case the card, back to the client. And keep in mind that the cookie is always once it is set over a connection, it is always used by the client implicitly. You don't have to do anything in in your application. So this is something which happen in the cookies. You can see it actually if you inspect the HTTP requests and responses is set in the headers of those two objects, okay, of those two of the request and the response. So if you check the headers of these two request and response, you will see a cookie, which is typically something. I mean, the cookie can be anything. It can be, but typically what you do is to first of all encode obfuscated information, in the sense that you don't want the client typically to look at sensitive information that you store in the cookie, and you don't want even to the user to be able to tamper with it. So you typically provide some kind of signature over the session identifier that you provide to the user itself. So we're going to see that the libraries available in Node for managing cookies are going to do everything for us. So typically setting up a cookie in a web application, it's very simple. Okay. So that means that since the server can store anything in a cookie, this means that we can also store, for example, directly the user identifier. Let me go to the next slide. Okay. The server can even store the user identifier in the cookie itself. Okay, you can see this as a JSON object. The cookie has a JSON object with a field that has the user identifier instead of the session identifier. And that's something you could do in principle. And but keep in mind that you don't want you still want to have the client not tamper with the user identifier, because if you set a cookie of one user and the client modifies this cookie, of course, it might present a source of security problem. You don't want the client to look at look and tamper with this identifier. So as I said before, one way to avoid this is to assign the cookie, and this is done already by the library that we're going to use. And the other thing is to use an HTTP only option when setting the cookie. And this means that the client JavaScript code cannot see the user identifier. It's so it becomes something which is transparent with the user, and it's just used by the browser to tag each next request that the client does towards the server. So, of course, if you have a user identifier stored in the request coming from the client, you can use directly the user identifier without any other additional database access. So having information stored in a cookie can, if done well, of course, if you are able to avoid the tampering and looking and making making it transparent to the client, it can allow you to avoid additional requests towards the databases to get information about the current user, the user that is currently accessing your API. So one extreme example of this, storing all the information of the current user. An extreme example are the JSON Web Tokens, also called JWT. And in this case, to avoid the server access into a database on each request, you store into a web token all the state information, user identifier, for example, and all the other information, the state of the cart, and so on. It's something which might be seen as an extension of the mechanisms of cookies somewhat, but it becomes more problematic from other point of view, and we're not going to really have a look at JWT. We are going to stick with the plain old cookies. However, keep in mind that in the project that we did in the last years, someone has chosen to use JWT for managing authentication towards the server, and but we're not going to do that in these tutorials. But feel free to choose even more complex, if you feel comfortable, more complex ways of authenticating users. So now, all the information that we pass in the cookie is called the session state. Okay, and first of all, we have to modify a little bit the, if you remember yesterday, we, let's say we introduced in the HTML file some part that was needed to do the authentication. That is, we wrote in the HTML file the, let me take back the, HTML file was stored in www.index.html. So we introduce a form part that was connected, was connected to the /user/login endpoint. Now, what do we mean with this action? So when you press the submit button, the browser performs a post request towards the this endpoint by passing these values. And so we are going to modify the users /login endpoint, the controller, to perform a very simple validation. It will be a very dummy validation, but we're going to set the session state on that particular event. Okay, so whenever we receive a user login, a post to that endpoint, we're going to change the session state if the user is has validated correctly with his own credential. We're going to change the session state, and all these successive requests that will come from this from the same client will contain that session information. Okay, so one way to so, and if you remember, of course, the HTML page was presenting the form, but we still need to modify the backend to, you know, perform the validation of the credential and for setting up the cookie. But just to show that it is actually working, we are going also to extend this HTML file with the, let's say, an additional script, part of the script, where we fetch the endpoint that we introduced yesterday, which is called /users/me, which, if the user is currently logged in, so if in the past the user has correctly validated the credential, so if the cookie is set up correctly, this operation must return the data associated with the current user. Otherwise, it must return an error. Okay. So we're going to fetch this response. Now, first of all, we have to get the element of the page where we are going to show the current user information, because at the end of this fetch, we are going to update the page with the currently logged in user. and we're going to get the dot user, this div here, which is used for for rendering the user information. Now it is empty, but this is updated dynamically once we receive correctly the data from the server. So now, in principle, if the response is not okay, we should somehow do something. I'm going to write the user is not logged in. I could even do an alert. Or better, sorry, let's just do something which is a little bit more. I can return a JSON object, which I would say with a message. Okay. Otherwise, we return the response.json. Okay. So we converted the, we either have the message, the error message, or the JSON of the response. And so when we get the JSON, we create a paragraph where we put the information of the user. Now, for the moment, I'm not going to let's do it like this. Okay. And I'm going to append this information to the div. To the div object that is in the current document. So whether if the user is correctly logged in, I'm going to show up the username. Otherwise, I'm going to show up, sorry, you must be logged in, just to have a simple example of how to fetch towards this endpoint. But now, for the moment, we didn't introduce any way to check for the well, in principle, that depends on the if some of the actions must be allowed only to a certain subset of users. That depends on the actual functionality of your website. So if you, and last year, for example, we've had the specification of the web server where about also users that were a certain subset of users that were allowed to do something more instead of only browsing the content of the server. So that depends on the specification of your web application. Just answer this to the Riccardo Sommaruca who asked whether is it mandatory to have a login in our website. That depends. of course, on what you want to create. But in principle, whenever a user wants to edit something, or for example, whenever a user wants to have a cart of something or a list of items that must be updated by the user and belongs to the user itself, then you might want to have a way to check for user validation. Okay, so coming back to, we have created our own web page. For the moment, it's something which, if you remember correctly, we have our skeleton now of the server that returns example data for the for all the endpoints that we have specified. So for the moment, authentication doesn't work. We have to modify the server in order to to introduce validation. And to do that, we need a few more libraries. The first is a cookie session. These are all middlewares that are used for the Connect framework that we're using for producing our server, and that we have to let's say, insert just as we did yesterday with the server static assets. So these are modules that we will attach to the Connect system in order to provide also session, in order to use cookie for managing sessions. And the second library is called Cookie Parser. And that's pretty much it, in the sense that these are the two libraries that we need. Now we're going to modify index.js, and we have to load up the modules. And now to use these, we are going to attach them through the usual app.use invocation to attach them to the server. Okay, and we attach first cookie parser, and then we attach cookie session. Now, cookie session must be initialized with an object. And now we're going to see how to, what is this object? This object defines how the cookie is structured. For the moment, we are going to name the cookie with the session. So what does it mean? It means that whenever the server receives a login request from the client and validates its credential, the server can set up the cookie by writing into the session object of the request. Now we're going to see, but the fact that here I've specified session means that later on in the controllers objects, I can modify the cookie by directly referring to session. Okay, and the second thing that we can specify in these objects are the keys with which the cookie is obfuscated. These are, example keys that are used in rotation. I'm just going to use very simple strings. Okay, but this allows us to really obfuscate the cookie content. You can check over the cookie session page. By the way, each of the modules that I'm using here can be, the documentation for this module can be inspected by on the web, and typically you want to go to the npm.js. Just let me show quickly, because probably this is something which is not for those of you who are starting with Node.js. npm.js. Okay, so this is the npmjs.com website, and you typically can find documentation about all the modules that I'm using by looking for so cookie session. You can see here cookie session middleware, and this is the module that we are using, and you can see here all the documentation about the function that and the configuration options that you can use for cookie sessions. So I'm just using a few of them just to give you a rough idea of what does it mean to implement session management, but of course it can be arbitrarily complex. So going back to our code, we have set up the cookie session, and now we have to modify the controllers. Okay, very simply, in the sense that first of all we have to modify the login endpoint in order to set up, if the user has provided correct credentials, to set up the cookie within the next requests. Okay, and well, for now, what I'm going to do, typically you want to the service user.user login post. This should be modified in order to validate the credential. Okay, this is for the moment it's just the example data that I've put in by OpenAPI specification, but in principle that is the method that you want to modify to check whether the provided password matches with the username. We are not going to do that. Okay, we don't have time to really set up the concrete validation with passwords, either within a database or something even more complex. But we are going to assume that the user login post returns the example data that we have. So it returns the correct user associated with the password. So we assume that there is no, actually this .catch is not called, is never called. So we're going to show only how to set up the cookie here once the password has been validated. And to set up this cookie, we are going to, this is might seem strange, but we modify the request rec object, which is the current request coming from the client, by writing into the session field, the one that we specified once we have loaded the cookie session, object, and we are going to let's say create. I could return in principle the object that has been returned by the user, but this is not needed. I could return only the user identifier. So the user identifier, it's, if I remember correctly, let me just check 1 second from the service. User service ED. This is the ED object. Okay. So the response here, it's the object coming from the user's login post, which is the current user actually. So I'm going to set in the cookie a field user UID, which corresponds to the ID of the user, and that pretty much sets up the cookie. So whenever the client does a new action, a new request over the server, such for example users me get, if the user is has correctly provided the credentials, so the next thing we are going to do here, it's just something which looks like there is a problem with the network. Please advise me, tell me if you have problems in hearing me. As I was saying before, all the successive requests will contain the session identifier. Okay. Now, the fact that we used the form to provide with an action, of course, to provide the data from the browser towards the server. This is managed a little bit let's say this is a little bit more complex, only because we use the form in the HTML page. So we must somehow redirect once this response is generated, redirect the browser towards the root of the towards again index.html. So we're going to return in the so this 301, it's the code for redirecting the client towards again index.html. So if the user correctly logs in, we are going to redirect it again into /index.html. If we don't do this, then the browser goes to the location of the action. So we must redirect the user towards the re-rendering the web page, the root web page. Okay. So my My Teams is telling me that there is bad network quality. So let me check whether I just asked one question. Okay. Okay, fine. So, okay, good. Then there is no problem. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so we are setting up the cookie and we are redirecting back the client towards re-rendering index.html. So now we must modify the other endpoint and check whether the current request has a user identifier which is different from 0. So if this is okay, then we're going to respond back with the data. Otherwise, we are going to write back an error message and this is going to return a 401 instead of a 200 status code. Okay, so only if the user is logged in, I'm going to return the information. Otherwise, you must provide valid credentials. Now, let's start the server. If you remember, we have to provide a database URL environment variable. Provided that, okay. Now, if we go to localhost 8080, okay. So at the moment, the fetch that we do at user.me, let me take it back. We just follow this path here. So if the response is not okay, remember that we did a request to users.me, and since the user has not provided any credential, the cookie in the request has not been set. And so the answer coming from the server is not okay, it's 401. And this particular case is managed by this if here. If not the response, if the response is not okay, if it's 401, then we just in the end fill up the information with the sorry, you must be logged in with by rewriting the name. Okay. Otherwise, this object here, this function here returns the actual data coming from the server. Okay, just to have a look at what is happening, let me open the network tab. Okay, and just let me re-render the information so to see that all the requests that are that have been done towards the. And as you can see here, we see a /user/me request, which you know, got as a 401 with the error that we wrote in the server. Now let's look at the headers, and we see that for the moment there is no information about cookies. Okay, nor neither in the request, of course, nor in the response. So it's something which we must look at now, because we're going to check after we log in what happens with the network connection. So now, since it's the credential validation is fake, whatever I provide here is really not checked in our system. I can even full bar. When I submit, remember that this is going to be a post towards my server, which is going to set up the cookie and redirect me towards the towards re-rendering index.html. Okay, so we do submit, and we got interestingly this got 200. This must redirect us. Something is not redirecting us. Let me check. Okay, so something is not working. Let's see. Okay, let's check in the controllers and user. Okay, let's maybe redirect directly to the root. I got the 200 response, but in principle I should receive a 301 redirection here on user login. So this is something which looks a bit strange. Let's see whether accessing the response object is maybe doing something bad over the server. Let's see. As usual, the demonstrations are, if something can go wrong, as the Murphy law says, it will go wrong. So let's see. Okay. So that was accessing the response ID. Maybe it was something wrong. Okay, let's shut down the server. Let's see what is happening now directly. So now it works. Then let's check the network requests. Okay, so I must probably remove the cookie, otherwise okay, let's go and see. Okay, /b. So the cookie is stored now in has been set correctly. There was a problem with the accessing the response ID, which I modified, and let's see the response the request now to /user/me has a cookie set which is called session, and which contains the obfuscated information of the user identifier. Okay, this is something which I mean, here it's obfuscated, but of course, whenever you access it on server side, the deobfuscation is going to be done transparently for you. You are going to really get again access to the session field of the request, which will have the the user ID in plain sight. But whenever you check within the headers of the requests coming from the client, and even the original one that was sent to the client itself is obfuscated. You cannot really access the information contained therein. And you also have a signature which is used by the cookie session module to verify that you are not tampering with the session state itself. That's pretty much it for what concerns a very simple flow of managing authentication with cookies. And okay, so that pretty much concludes this very synthetic but hopefully helpful tutorials on how to set up the backend for your web application. Let me just recap a few bits, and then we can move to the question and answer from you guys. So let's go to the okay, so by recapping, my suggestion, and that has been somehow presented in the past 3 lectures and also in this one, is to implement your web application by specifying the first of all the API through a standard formalism. That is the Open API, and this allows you to produce the skeleton of a server that is composed of not only the middleware that is used for managing and all the routing towards your endpoints, but also the skeleton of the controllers and the skeleton of the services. Now, in principle, the distinction between controllers and services is somewhat customary. This is done by the Swagger editor generator, and but it allows you to discipline your web application development in the sense that in the controllers there must be all the action that must be done with the requests themselves. That is, for example, checking for credential and maybe caching if you think about caching data instead of going towards the data layer. While the services are much more objects that are somewhat used for providing access to the data into the database. And keep in mind that in the application server, everything is an application domain object. So it might be that an application domain object, a single application domain object is might be realized in the database with multiple tables. This was not the case in this tutorial, but it could be. And we've seen how to attach a database by using a layer, intermediate layer for managing transparently multiple types of databases. If you want to change in the future database, you might do so by very few effort. And we also seen how to extend the application server to provide also the static asset, the HTML files. And this is more or less the infrastructure that you might need for your web application. So with that, I just finish here. I stop here, and I'm just available for a question and answer up to 10 o'clock, which is the standard closure time for these tutorials. But feel free in the future to ask for help. You can send me an email. We can set up a one-to-one meeting, and then so there is a question: what do you mean by deploying the project? So with deploying the project, I mean so now the server is running on my machine, but in principle, and my machine is closed. Nobody can access my machine. You want your server to be available in a public URL, which corresponds to a server located somewhere in the internet. So deploying your application means making the application available on the public internet. And so deploying the project means, let's say, setting up a server, a remote server, which might be, for example, Heroku or Google Cloud Platform. There are several platforms that you could use for, setting up the server in order to be usable from any user in the internet. So we're not going to require any specific. In the past, we asked the people to deploy, so to create a server on the Heroku platform. Keep in mind that the server is going to be accessed by the evaluators remotely. So it cannot be on your local host, because you would have to provide access to your machine, and in principle this is going to be a little bit difficult. So you might want to create to deploy your server on a public server, and there are several options, most of them free. Heroku has a free tier for managing servers, and also provides also a free tier for using a Postgres database. So and the interface, it's very simple. I can show you. Let's see. Okay, so let's see whether just well, GitHub Pages, Elena Palombini, GitHub Pages cannot provide you with the database access. So GitHub Pages is only used for static pages. So it's not going to work for your web application, since at least the database must be present. Okay. Your application will be, providing dynamic data to the client by getting it from a database. So Gerlando Re is asking for security for Node.js. Well, it depends on what do you mean, in the sense that if you mean managing, for example, HTTP sessions, secure sessions, this is already done by, for example, Heroku. So you might not need to manage any in your application any security certificates and so on. While you might want to look into the NPM package management database, whether there is something which is useful for what you mean with security. So I don't know Spring Security. I don't know what it provides, so I'm not able to answer in more details. Okay, Luca Barsottini is asking for, is it possible to use Express for Node.js? Yes, but keep in mind that Node.js can also allow you to generate server-side the HTML pages by rendering them with the data coming from the database. This means that, and this is not allowed by the instructors of the course, in the sense that the evaluators will check whether your site gets through HTTP requests the raw data to be rendered on the client. This is possible to do with the Express, and in fact, Express it's an extension of the Connect framework. So it's a much more comfortable way of managing the REST API. But keep in mind that if you start from the OpenAPI specification and produce the skeleton, this is not going to use Express. This is going to use Connect. So you could use it, but I mean, you have to keep aligned the OpenAPI specification with what you do with Express. So it's going to be a little bit less, comfortable, I would say. So Christopher, Francesco Pellizzi asks if it is possible to define endpoints not publicly accessible, but accessible only with pages. I mean, it depends what you mean from within the pages. The best way to do it is to just, if you mean that the user must be logged in, then, I mean, the endpoints are those specified in API, and you must check whether the cookie is set or not. So, in principle, it is the correct way to manage the state. So there is a new an extension to the question. For instance, if we are interested in showing the list of available books in a page, but we are not interested in returning a JSON file with the same information, I don't understand the question. So can you just maybe open your mic and just ask directly?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I mean, if with the example we saw during these lessons, for instance, if we access the endpoint books from within CURL, we are returning a JSON file with the list of all the books in the database. Right?
Yes. Okay.
What if we don't want to make this endpoint public? I mean, I need the list of all the books in our site because I want to show within the site the list of the books. But if I access from CURL this endpoint, I don't want to return the JSON file with the list of all books.
This is very unusual, because everything you expose towards and in principle, it's very difficult to avoid this, in the sense that whatever you can do with a browser, you can do it with curl. If you, for example, any request that you see in the network, let's do this. Any request that you do here to the endpoints has a curl equivalent, which you can now you don't see the menu I opened with the right click on the mouse, but in Chrome you can just copy that request as a curl command. So in principle, any request that can be done with a browser can be done with a curl. Will be a very complex curl command, but the curl is equivalent to a request coming from the browser. There is nothing that you can really do. You can even emulate a user agent and the browser with curl, so it's not possible. And this is something you don't want to do, because whenever you create an API through a standard format like this one, you might want to be able to test your API with different means other than the browser itself. So having, for example, a test infrastructure for your API that runs in the command line, that is something which is very important for keeping your API correct through the iteration that you're going to pass when you are developing it. So so what you're asking is very unusual and might be even counterproductive. So in principle, the correct way of masking resource data in a server, it's by using authentication. That's pretty much the only way you can do that. Okay, so I'm still here just to, if you have any questions. I was showing before the Heroku platform, and well, you can see here, this was a old application that I deployed over the Roku platform. This is a Node.js server that is running remotely, and typically you want to use these platforms by setting up a Git repository and linking it into the platform itself, so that whenever you change your repository, that action is going to trigger a new rebuild of your project, and so that you get always the latest updated version running on the platform itself. And so as you can see here, I've linked my GitHub repository of the server, and if I click here, you can see that there is a repository. This was a previous year example. So it's a repository containing all the index.js that you've seen, the controllers, the service, and so on. And it's a very simple way of deploying a server, just hooking up the GitHub repository and just start the server. So there is a button here, open application. I don't know, maybe it will take some time. And as you can see, well, it takes some time because the server is sleeping while you don't, and let me just increase. Okay. So just to show you that now the server is running on Heroku, and will have a prefix if you deploy it on Heroku that corresponds to the name of the application that you provide, and it's going to use automatically HTTPS. So don't need any way to in a free domain, Eduardo Epifani, it depends what do you mean? Something which is free, I mean, even Heroku is free for setting up these simple applications. And it was used in the past for all the projects for the Hypermedia course. So it's also able to really manage, simple medium-sized project. It's something, I mean, the free tier. Yes, the code, it's well, the code that I wrote in these lectures, I will provide you with the notes of these 4 lectures. These are PDF notes where you can see all the code that we have written together with the comments. So I'm going to provide it to provide you with the notes today. I'm going to send the notes to the guys, to the instructors of the course for to publish them on the usual channels. I think that BIP probably is used by the instructors to publish this type of documents. So I will provide you with the information to replicate all that we did in these 4 lectures. Don't worry. Just another quick comment about using a platform as a service. instead of setting up you know, a private server, a VPS on your own, in the sense that Heroku provides already a platform that is all the Node.js runtime is set up for you, so you don't have to install anything on this machine. Everything it's already set up for to be used. That means that also, for example, Postgres, it's already installed, and you might activate. It's Postgres. It's one of the add-ons, and you can configure them. And let's see, find more add-ons. And if you search for databases, data source, there is a Heroku Postgres, and there is a free tier for Heroku Postgres. So you just click a button, and you will have available Postgres for free, with the limitations, of course. And in principle, if you use the database URL environment variable, as we did, this is going to be set up by this add-on before starting your server. So you will be automatically connected to the database instance that you have installed. So in principle, you will not need any modification to the code. The only modification that you might need to do to your application is the modifying the let's go back to the Swagger specification, Swagger editor. The only thing that you might want to modify is the host path, because now if you deploy your application on a public web server, here you must need to put the actual URL, public URL of your server. So for example, here, in principle, if I go to docs, that should, since this demo server was set up also using by OpenAPI, by accessing docs, we access the page associated with the documentation. And if I try out, for example, you can see here that the curl command uses correctly the public URL of the website. So so that it works by querying directly the server running on the public server, not the localhost one. So everything is running completely in the cloud. And that's pretty much it. I mean, the interface with Heroku, it's very simple, but you could use in principle also their similar platform as a service. I guess that maybe AWS, so Amazon Web Services, has something similar, which is called probably EC2. Honestly, I think that Heroku is much more simpler than AWS. It does a lot less, of course. AWS is a complete, it's a immense infrastructure. Heroku is much more focused on, setting you up and running with as few steps as possible with your public web server by, avoiding to set up a a server from zero, a public server from zero. So I think it's a good choice, and this is going to be the choice also used by I think Piero Fraternali, who is doing a course on the actual course on backends, because this is these are only for lectures which are a very short tutorial on this kind of stuff, but in the course of Piero Fraternali, they're also going to use Heroku, which is very, very simple. But if you feel free to even experiment, there have been questions with about Google Cloud Platform. That is something which I never evaluated, but it could be an alternative solution. Also Microsoft Azure or IBM, for example. Every major company now is providing a platform as a service. Now feel free to choose the one that you feel much more comfortable. I'd suggest this one, but feel free to choose. Backend technical documentation. Francesco Peresini, maybe there has been a typo where it has been written, but we mean the backend prototype and backend technical documentation. And this is going to be the instructors of the course are going to give you a set of requirements for the documentation that you must provide with the backend server. So backend technical means backend technical documentation. There has been probably a typo, but I will tell to the instructors of the course to put online both my notes of these 4 lectures and also the requirements for the technical documentation of the backend, and so that now you can have a look at them. So I'm still here waiting if you have any other questions. Okay. Let me stop